Now your claim is, and I guess it's more than really a claim, but your claim is that these various businesses, when they sent him into the boiler, when people were working at these various plants, that the owners or that the big people who should know did know that there was a problem there. Is that right? That's your claim, that
yes,
they knew that this was a problem?
Yes. Whether could I identify any particular person in that plant at that time that knew about it? I can't answer that question. I knew that we do know that the higher ups, the people who were in the position to take precautions, knew and didn't.
Mm-hmm. And you said scientists were saying that. How far back are we talking about that scientists first began to report that this could be a problem for human beings?
I think it was back in the early 50s that materials started to come out. Knowledge was, some will say knowledge was suppressed. It didn't get to the workplace. And people who helped build our country were unnecessarily exposed. I'm lucky. I've never worked in a factory, but in the course of the last several years, I come to know people who built our country.
Mm-hmm.
They're heroes, really, and they weren't provided with the protection that would have prevented the exposure that's causing, even now, these diseases. Lung cancer can be related to asbestos. And you mentioned asbestosis, which is not a malignant form of cancer, but can be extremely debilitating, chaining people to oxygen tents and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And how long does someone have to live like that? Like the whole rest of their life?
Yes.
So
there is no known cure for mesothelioma.
Right.
It is a terminal lung cancer. We luckily do have some men who have lasted several years with it. Mm-hmm. But it's not something you survive.
You know, it's interesting. I have personal experience in that there was a woman that I met who had been a stewardess for TWA, and she had been doing that, I don't know, like 30 years or something, and then was laid off when a lot of the flight attendants were laid off. And so then she was changing her career, and that's when I met her. And so she was doing fine. She was going to school. Then all of a sudden she was gone. And I called her up, and it comes out that she has mesothelioma. And her husband, who was a doctor, had arranged for her to go to some specialist clinic down in Houston, I believe it was. They did the operation. They thought that it was successful. I talked to her on the phone several times thereafter. One day I called, and the husband answers, "Oh no, she's gone."
Yeah.
And that all this occurred within a year, like you said.
Yeah, it can take people very quickly. I really don't understand, nor can I predict how that can happen. But mesothelioma can be located in the pleural of the lungs or in the lower abdomen. I think depending on the diagnosis and the form of treatment and what people are willing to go through, you can preserve, you can lengthen life, but as I indicated, that it's not survivable.
And the asbestosis, this is, you said, not always fatal, but you wind up living on oxygen.
Yes.
And how old are some of these people when they first are getting that disease?
50s, 60s.
So if they live to their 80s, or no?
They can, yes,
they can.
with certainly a diminished quality of life and an inability to do things that we take for granted, like taking out the trash or
going upstairs.
Exactly, yeah.
Or walking up a hill.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. So, all right. Now you're saying that many of these people who were exposed, they worked in an industrial setting where they were exposed on a regular basis to this. Is that what is required, that you have to have that level of exposure where you're in it for years and years and years, and then finally it shows up, like you said, 20, 30 years later? Or can it be a much lesser exposure level and still wind up contracting this disease?
It can be. We have clients who actually are spouses, even children of people who worked in places like Granite City Steel. When the men, again, back in the old days, guys came home in their work clothes. There were no moon suits. They came home, typically took off the clothes they wore, which are dusty and contaminated with asbestos fibers.
That's the part I forgot to mention about this woman that I knew. Her father had been one of those.
Exactly, sure.
She had no exposure directly.
These take-home cases, or sometimes how we refer to them, are not uncommon. And whether she or her mother did the laundry, the Surgeon General has indicated that there is no safe level of exposure to asbestos fiber. Plaintiffs and defendants' attorneys take directly contrary positions, and plaintiffs' attorneys will say a single exposure can cause it. Others say you need repeated, long-time exposure, but in any event, mesothelioma is a signature disease. It's caused only by asbestos exposure. So, for example, in your friend's case, she obviously was exposed somehow.
Through her father's clothes.
Right, and the lawyer's job is to identify the possible sources of that exposure and determine who can or should be potentially responsible.
Now we hear on television that there are certain things that at a certain point, whoever did a bad thing, that they're out because a certain amount of time has passed since the bad thing that they did happened. There's a legal term for that, but we're not here to talk legal terms today. But in the case of this, what you work on, you're talking about companies that did things 30 years ago, and they no longer, and they're still being able to hold them accountable?
Yes, in Illinois, a plaintiff has 2 years from the date of diagnosis to file a lawsuit.
Even though the exposure occurred 30 years before?
That can be the case, yes. In other states, it's longer. Missouri has a 3-year statute of limitation. Children have none, in effect.
That was the term, that statute of limitation.
Right. So it's 2 years from the date of diagnosis. That allows, again, the reason that makes sense in the context of asbestos exposure is because the latency period is so long. I mean, the man I mentioned before was exposed in probably the latest, maybe in the early 70s. The disease that killed him didn't manifest him until it was 2008. So he had 2 years from that diagnosis to file a lawsuit.